Normandy, the 6th of June 1944. A sunken farm lane, roughly a mile inland from a cliff called Pointe du Hoc. Two American sergeants are crouched in a double hedgerow, breathing hard, staring at something that should not be there. In front of them, tucked under netting and cut branches, sit 5 enormous field guns, French-built pieces of the last war, long barrels angled toward the sea, toward the beaches where thousands of American soldiers are at that moment wading ashore. The guns are clean. The ammunition is stacked and ready. Everything about the position says it was built to kill, and built with care, and there is not a single German standing beside it. One of the sergeants, a man named Leonard Lomel, later put the moment into plain words. He turned to his partner and said, close to this phrasing, "Jack, here they are, we have found them, and here are the guns." He had climbed a vertical cliff under machine gun fire that morning. He had been shot through the side, stepping off the landing craft. He had crossed a moonscape of craters, expecting to die at every hedgerow, and the thing he had been sent to destroy, the reason more than 200 men had been thrown at the most forbidding stretch of the Normandy coast, was sitting almost unguarded in a field, pointed at the invasion, and no crew was serving it. To understand why that is strange, you have to understand what the Germans thought they had done. They had not been careless. They had done something clever. Weeks earlier, they had seen the danger coming, and they had moved these guns off the cliff, away from the bombs, away from the naval shells, and hidden them inland, where no airplane and no battleship could easily find them. By every rule of war as the German army understood it, that decision should have saved the guns. It should have kept them firing on D-Day. Instead, it produced this: 5 priceless weapons, perfectly preserved, perfectly concealed, and about to be wrecked by 2 men with a handful of grenades. The question this story asks is a simple one, and the answer is not what most people assume. Why did moving the guns, hiding them so well that the attackers reached the cliff and found nothing but empty pits, fail to save them anyway? The answer has almost nothing to do with luck, though luck played its part. It has to do with 2 completely different ideas about how you protect a weapon, and the fact that the Germans were defending against a threat that was not the one coming for them. Let us start with the guns themselves, because they deserve to be taken seriously. It is easy, knowing how the day ended, to imagine they were second-rate. They were not. The battery at Pointe du Hoc was built around 6 heavy guns, French-designed pieces of the type called the Canon de 155mm Grande Puissance Filou, named for the French colonel who designed it in the middle of the First World War. The Germans had captured large numbers of these when France fell in 1940, and they put them to work all along the Atlantic coast. In German service, this particular type carried the label 15.5 cm K418, with a small letter F in brackets to mark it as French. These were not improvised junk. They were accurate, long-ranged guns mounted on concrete tables that let them swing smoothly to track a target far out at sea. And the range is the thing that mattered. The official United States Army account of the action states it without drama. With a range of 25,000 yards, the guns could put fire on the approaches to Omaha Beach and on the transport area offshore, and they could also reach the waters off Utah Beach to the west. Sit with that for a moment. A single battery, sitting on one cliff, could drop heavy shells onto 2 of the 5 invasion beaches and onto the crowded anchorage where troop ships waited to unload. On the morning of the 6th of June, the sea off Normandy held something close to 5,000 vessels. 6 guns of this size, firing steadily into that mass of shipping and onto those beaches, could have turned an already brutal morning into a catastrophe. To grasp why one battery could matter that much, you have to picture the shape of the American landings. The 2 beaches assigned to the United States forces, Utah to the west and Omaha to the east, were separated by a stretch of cliffed coast, and Pointe du Hoc sat almost exactly in the middle of that gap. It was the highest point for miles, a natural gun platform looking down on both approaches at once. A battery there did not have to choose between the 2 beaches. It could shift its fire from one to the other, and it could reach the ships standing offshore to unload the follow-up waves. Omaha Beach was already expected to be the hardest fight of the day, a narrow shelf of sand overlooked by bluffs thick with German positions. The planners knew Omaha would be a bloody place even in the best case. Adding heavy plunging fire from Pointe du Hoc into that equation was a nightmare no one wanted to test. That is why the cliff existed as a target at all. Pointe du Hoc is a blunt finger of rock jutting into the channel, and its cliffs rise between 85 and 100 feet, sheer to overhanging, straight up from a thin strip of stony beach. There is no cover down there. A man on that beach is a man standing at the bottom of a wall with the enemy at the top. The Germans looked at that geography and saw a fortress that nature had mostly built for them. They spent 1943 and the first half of 1944 making it stronger. The work was done by the organization TOT, the vast construction arm that built the concrete spine of the Atlantic Wall. They poured gun pits and shelters, and by the spring of 1944, they had begun the next stage, roofing the guns over inside thick enclosed concrete casemates that could shrug off almost anything the Allies could throw from the air. On the morning of the invasion, that upgrade was only half done. The official history is precise about it. 4 guns stood in open emplacements, and 2 were already casemated, with more casemate construction reported underway through April and May. There was also a heavy concrete observation bunker built out near the tip of the point, and this detail matters more than it first appears. A coastal gun is only as good as its eyes. The barrel does the killing, but it is the observer in that bunker, watching the sea and telephoning corrections back to the guns, who decides where the killing lands. The whole position was a system, not just a row of barrels. There is a quiet human detail in how the Germans built the place that tells you how seriously they guarded its secret. According to research drawn from German records, much of the labor was done by prisoners brought in from the Eastern Front, rather than by local French workers, precisely so that word of the battery's exact layout would be less likely to leak to the French population and out to the Allies. The men who held the finished position were coastal artillery soldiers, the 2nd Battery of Army Coast Artillery Battalion 1260, a unit of the German Army rather than the Navy, with infantry attached for close defense. French research names the battery commander as a lieutenant named Frido Eberling. That same battalion controlled a string of other gun positions along this stretch of coast. So the crews at Pointe du Hoc were not an isolated garrison, but one node in a wider belt of coastal artillery. This was a serious position, held by trained men, armed with guns that could reach the heart of the invasion. It is worth understanding what that belt of coastal artillery was part of, because it shapes the whole logic of the German defense. Hitler had ordered the building of what German propaganda called the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of fortifications running down the coast of occupied Europe from Norway to the Spanish border. The idea was to make any Allied landing so costly at the water's edge that it would fail before it could get inland. Concrete strongpoints, gun batteries, minefields, beach obstacles, and machine gun positions were poured and dug along hundreds of miles of coast. The whole doctrine rested on a single bet, that the decisive moment of an invasion would come on the beaches themselves, and that a landing could be smashed in the first hours by fixed defenses firing on an enemy still struggling out of the sea. Pointe du Hoc was a piece of that bet, a heavy battery meant to reach out and break up the landings before they could ever take hold. Everything about it, its cliff-top position, and its long-ranged guns, its concrete casemates, was designed around the assumption that the danger would come from the sea and be met with fire from the shore. The Allied planners knew almost all of it. They had been watching the point for months through the lens of aerial photography, and from the early part of 1944, those photographs showed the Germans steadily upgrading the site, turning open pits into enclosed casemates. Reports also filtered in from the French resistance and from local civilians. And here, the intelligence picture grew genuinely murky in a way that would matter enormously. Some reports suggested the Germans were moving the guns. On some Allied maps, the symbols for the guns were even replaced with a note that the positions were under construction. Photo interpreters could see churned earth and building work, but they could not see with certainty whether the long barrels were still in their pits or not. What no one could rule out was that the guns were still there, or could be rolled back into place at short notice. And even one working gun of that size, firing into the transport fleet, was a threat too serious to ignore. Faced with uncertainty, the planners made the only prudent choice. They assumed the worst and planned to destroy the battery no matter what the cameras seemed to show. That choice looks obvious in hindsight, but it was not a small thing to decide at the time. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Normandy coast again and again in the months before the invasion, cameras running, building an ever more detailed picture of the German defences. Interpreters pored over the prints, measuring shadows, tracking the slow growth of concrete, noting every change from one sortie to the next. At Pointe du Hoc, they could watch the casemates rising. They could see the scars of construction. What they could not do was reach into a covered pit and confirm whether a specific gun barrel was still inside it, or whether it had been trundled off down a farm lane in the night. The French resistance and local people passed word when they could, but their reports were fragments, sometimes contradictory, and always carrying the risk that a rumor had been mistaken for a fact. The planners were trying to make a life-and-death decision about thousands of men on the basis of shadows on photographs and whispers from occupied territory. In that fog, the safe assumption was the deadly one. Treat the guns as present and dangerous, and send men to make certain they could never fire. It was the right call, and the events on the point would prove it, even if the guns themselves were no longer where the maps said. So the conclusion at the top was not really in dispute. Pointe du Hoc had to be neutralized before those guns could fire, or the price would be paid in the water off two beaches. General Omar Bradley, who carried the weight of the American landings, wrote afterward that no soldier in his command had ever been handed a more difficult task than the one given to the 34-year-old commander of the force sent against that cliff. The job went to the Rangers. The American Ranger battalions were a young idea in 1944, born only 2 years earlier and modelled deliberately on the British commandos. The very first Rangers had trained in Scotland under commando instructors at a hard depot in the Highlands, and that culture of aggressive, independent, small unit fighting ran through the whole force. The idea behind the Rangers was to build units that could take on exactly the kind of mission no ordinary line battalion was shaped for. A raid against a fixed and difficult objective, carried out fast and with initiative, by men trained to keep going when a plan came apart. That last quality, the refusal to stop when the situation stopped matching the briefing, would turn out to be the decisive thing at Pointe du Hoc, though no one could have known it in advance. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had spent the spring of 1944 in southern England, conditioning itself with hard practice in rope and ladder work on cliffs, chosen to resemble those of the French coast, with British commando personnel giving all the help they could. They were preparing for exactly one kind of nightmare: climbing a defended cliff, from the sea, under fire. It is worth dwelling on how strange and specialized that task is. Infantry are trained to cross ground. These men were being trained to cross a vertical wall, weighed down with weapons and equipment, while an enemy at the top did everything possible to send them back down. There was no margin in it. A man who lost his grip did not get a second attempt. They worked out a whole toolkit of strange equipment for the problem. Rockets that fired grappling hooks trailing ropes and rope ladders up and over the cliff edge, plain climbing ropes and toggle ropes, long extension ladders of tubular steel that came apart into 4-foot sections so they could be carried in a boat and assembled at the base of the cliff. And most memorably of all, 4 amphibious trucks, the ones the troops called ducks, each carrying a tall extension ladder requisitioned from the London Fire Brigade, with a pair of machine guns mounted at the very top so a ranger could climb up and fire down onto the cliff edge while his friends came up the ropes below him. It was inventive, and it was desperate, and it tells you how hard the planners understood this assault would be. Nobody mounts fire brigade ladders on amphibious trucks unless the ordinary answers have already run out. The man in command was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a Texan in his middle 30s who had coached college football before the war, at Tarleton and elsewhere, before the army took him. Rudder was not a professional soldier by background. He was a teacher and a coach who had come up through the reserves, and the men who served under him remembered a commander who led from the front and expected a great deal, of himself first. The plan handed the direct assault on the point to 3 companies of his 2nd Battalion, D, E, and F, totaling about 225 men, including a small headquarters detachment. They would land at the base of the cliffs, climb under fire, cross the top, and destroy the 6 guns. A larger force of Rangers waited offshore, ready to follow if the first wave got up the cliff and sent the success signal, or to divert to Omaha Beach and come the long way overland if that signal never came. There is a moment before the landing that tells you how much doubt already hung over this mission, and it is worth telling because it is true, and because it shows these were thinking men, not blind ones. Aboard ship, a senior Ranger officer, a major named Cleveland Lytle, who had been slated to lead the assault force, heard the intelligence suggesting the guns had already been pulled off the cliff. He became convinced, loudly and bitterly, that the whole assault was pointless, and that men would die climbing a cliff to reach empty holes. He argued the point hard enough, and by some accounts had been drinking enough, that Rudder relieved him of the assault command on the spot and decided to lead it in person. Rudder's reasoning was simple. A commander cannot lead men up a cliff into fire if he does not believe the climb is worth making. Lytle went on to fight elsewhere in Normandy and later earned a high decoration of his own, so this was not a story of a coward, but of a capable officer who read the intelligence and drew a reasonable, and as it turned out incomplete, conclusion. But notice what sits inside that argument on the ship. Even before the landing craft went in, there were people in the Allied camp who suspected the guns had moved. The mission went ahead anyway. Hold that thought, because it is the hinge of the whole story. The morning itself went wrong almost immediately. The sea was rough and cold, and the little landing craft took on water and pitched in the swell. One craft carrying about 20 men of Company D swamped and went down miles from shore, spilling its men into the channel to be picked up later. A supply craft sank, leaving a single survivor. Another boat had to throw packs overboard just to stay afloat. And then the small craft leading the column lost its bearings in the smoke and haze and steered toward the wrong headland, a point called Pointe de la Percée, about 3 miles east of the real target. Rudder caught the mistake and forced the column to turn and run parallel to the coast, under fire from the shore, to reach the correct cliff. But the correction cost dearly in time. Instead of touching down at 6:30 in the morning as planned, the first Rangers reached the base of Pointe du Hoc at around 38 minutes past the hour of the assault, close to 10 minutes past 7. That delay mattered more than it sounds. The naval and air bombardment had been timed to hammer the cliff top right up to the moment of landing, then lift so the assault could go in clean. When the Rangers arrived late, the heaviest bombardment had already lifted, and the German defenders had been handed a priceless gift of time. Time to climb up out of their shelters, shake off the shock of the shelling, man the cliff edge, and look down at the boats coming in. The battleship Texas had thrown its 14-inch shells at the point in the pre-dawn hours. Destroyers stood close inshore to help, including the American destroyer Satterlee and the British destroyer Talibont. But when the ramps dropped, the infantry still had to climb, and the men at the top were waiting for them. The naval guns offshore were not a side note to this fight. They were, at moments, the thing that kept the Rangers alive. The warships supporting the landings were the outer edge of a bombardment plan that had begun softening the whole Normandy coast in the pre-dawn dark, and Pointe du Hoc, as one of the most dangerous single positions in the American sector, drew heavy attention. The battleship Texas alone threw a large weight of 14-inch shells at the point before the landing craft arrived, trying to stun the defenders and collapse their positions. Once the Rangers were on the cliff, and the big ships had to hold their fire for fear of hitting their own men, the 2 destroyers standing close inshore took over the delicate work, firing along the cliff edge just ahead of the climbing men. That kind of fire support, dropped within yards of friendly troops on a vertical face, demanded precise communication between the men on the point and the gunners at sea, and it is here that a small piece of improvisation became a lifesaver. With the radios drowned, Lieutenant Aichner used his signal lamp to talk to the destroyer Satterlee, and by that flickering light, the Rangers were able to call the ship's guns onto German positions that were holding them up. Aigner said afterward that the old lamp had been a lifesaver for them at a very critical moment, and he was not exaggerating. And climb they did, into one of the most extraordinary few minutes of the entire invasion. The ropes were soaked and heavy with seawater, and many of the rocket-fired grapnels fell short of the top and slid back down. Germans leaned over the edge to fire down and to cut ropes and drop grenades. Rangers went up hand over hand anyway, using the ladders, using the ropes that had caught, cutting handholds into the wet clay with knives where they had to. One ranger, a private named Harry Roberts, went up a rope to the top in something like 40 seconds, was cut off when his rope was severed, tied on again, and brought his team up behind him. Another, a sergeant on a Browning automatic rifle, hosed the cliff edge with long bursts to drive the grenade throwers back and cover the men below. The climbing itself took every form the training had prepared for, and some it had not. Some men went up the tubular steel ladders. Some went up the plain ropes hand over hand, and one ranger found to his surprise that he could simply walk himself up a rope, boots against the clay, when the grapnel had bitten well at the top. Others, where a rope had been cut or a ladder had failed, cut and clawed their own way up the soft, wet face of the cliff with knives and bare hands. Men were hit and fell. Men were pinned halfway up with nowhere to go but on. The wonder of it, looking back, is not that some did not make it, but that so many did, and so fast, against a defended height that ought by every reasonable measure to have stopped them cold. Sergeant Lomel, hit by a bullet through his side as he stepped off the landing craft, kept climbing regardless and made it to the top. The destroyers offshore saw where the German fire was coming from and shaved the cliff edge with their own guns to knock the defenders back. Within roughly 15 to 30 minutes of chaos and death, Rangers were over the lip of the cliff and onto the point. What they found up there stopped many of them cold. The top of Pointe du Hoc did not look like Earth anymore. Weeks of bombing and that morning's shelling had turned it into a churned wasteland of overlapping craters, broken concrete, torn wire, and smoking pits. Men moved across it from crater to crater, because a crater was the only cover left. Rudder set up his command post in a hole near the cliff edge, and his communications officer, a lieutenant named Aigner, worked to get a signal out reporting that the Rangers were up. But the radios were soaked and largely dead, and Aigner fell back on older tools, a signal lamp of First World War vintage, and even carrier pigeons, to get word to the ships. The larger force of Rangers waiting offshore had by then already given up waiting, because the success signal came too late, and they had turned for Omaha Beach to come overland. The men on the point were, for the moment, on their own. And now came the discovery that defines this story. The Rangers fought their way to the gun positions, the whole reason they had come, the emplacements they had studied on maps and photographs until they knew them by heart. One party after another reached its assigned pit, and each made the same discovery in turn. The guns were not there. In the concrete positions where 6 heavy French guns should have stood, there was nothing but wreckage, and in some of the emplacements, timber. Telephone poles and heavy wooden beams had been set up in the pits and angled to look, from high above in a reconnaissance aircraft, like the barrels of guns. It was a decoy, a stage set built to keep Allied photo interpreters convinced the battery was still armed and in place. The official army history reached the plain conclusion that the guns had been removed from the point before the period of major bombardments. We can now say fairly precisely why, and it is a more interesting answer than simple German caution. The relocation was driven by the Allies' own bombs. The air campaign against Pointe du Hoc had begun back on the 15th of April, when medium bombers first struck the point. Then on the 25th of April came a heavy and notably accurate raid that tore into the position. Modern study of the cratering on the site suggests it was this accurate April raid, more than any other single blow, that convinced the German defenders the guns were no longer safe in their exposed pits on the cliff. Sometime after that raid, most likely in the last days of April rather than in June as some older accounts claimed, the Germans pulled the guns back off the point and concealed them inland, leaving the wooden decoys behind to keep the cameras satisfied. More raids followed through May and into early June, and on the night before the invasion, the heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force struck the point again. Every one of those later raids fell on guns that were no longer there. The concealment, judged purely as a way to keep bombs off the guns, had already succeeded completely. Now put yourself in the boots of a ranger standing in that empty pit on the morning of the 6th of June. You have climbed a cliff. You have watched friends fall from the ropes into the sea and onto the rocks below. You have crossed a field of craters, certain you would be next. And the thing you came to destroy is simply gone, replaced by logs. It would have been the easiest thing in the world and the most human to feel that it had all been for nothing. Years later, that exact feeling would harden into a myth about Pointe du Hoc, the idea that the Rangers climbed the cliff for empty holes, that the whole bloody effort was a tragic waste. That myth is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is the heart of everything that follows. Because the Rangers did not stop. This is where the German plan begins to fail, and it fails for reasons that have nothing to do with the cleverness of moving the guns and everything to do with what kind of enemy was coming. The Rangers had a second task written into their orders, beyond destroying the guns. They were to push inland off the point, cross the fields, and reach the paved coastal highway that ran behind the cliff, the main lateral road the Germans used to move troops along that stretch of the Grand Camp to Vierville coast. They were to cut that road and hold a position blocking it, so even with the gun pits standing empty, the Rangers had somewhere they were required to be, and they went. Small groups pushed off the cratered point, through the hedgerows, and inland toward the highway. Within a couple of hours, a mixed force of Rangers had set up a roadblock across that coastal road, and here the geography of the German plan turned against the Germans. When they moved the guns, they had not hauled them miles into the deep interior. They had pulled them back only about a kilometre, a bit more than 1,000 metres, and set them in a concealed position among the orchards and hedgerows behind the point. It was far enough to escape the bombing of the cliff, but it sat squarely inside the belt of country the Rangers had just been ordered to occupy and control. The mission to cut the coastal road and the hidden location of the guns pointed to the very same patch of Normandy farmland. Without knowing it, the Germans had moved their guns directly into the path of the men sent to find them. Two of those men were First Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn of Company D. Having reached the coastal road with a small group and set up their position across it, they noticed something in the dirt of a narrow sunken lane running inland between high hedgerows. The lane showed marks. Something heavy had been dragged or driven along it recently. Lommel later described the instinct plainly. It looked as though something big had passed that way, and so the two of them followed the lane inland, not knowing where it led. They were two sergeants walking down a farm track behind enemy lines, with no idea what was at the end of it. What was at the end of it was the battery. About 250 yards down the lane, in a camouflaged position tucked among the hedges and trees, sat 5 of the 6 missing guns. They were set up in battery, ready to fire, aimed toward Utah Beach, with piles of ammunition stacked close at hand, and not a German was standing among them. There was no crew at the guns at all. That was the moment Lommel turned to Kuhn and said the words about having found them. Across an open field, perhaps 100 meters away, Lommel could see a body of German troops, something like 100 men, gathered together and apparently forming up. The most reasonable reading, then and now, is that these were the gun crews and their supporting infantry, pulled back from the exposed position to shelter from the tremendous bombardment and waiting for the order to reoccupy the guns and open fire. And this is the strange, almost unbelievable pivot of the entire day. The most dangerous battery in the American sector was sitting loaded and aimed at the invasion, and the men who should have been serving it were standing in a field the length of a football pitch away, while 2 enemy sergeants stood among their guns. Lommel did not waste the gift. He told Kuhn to cover him and to hand over his grenades. The Rangers carried thermite grenades, incendiary devices that do not explode so much as burn, throwing out a molten heat fierce enough to melt metal and weld moving parts solidly together. Lommel moved to the guns and went to work. He jammed thermite into the recoil mechanisms and the traversing gears of the first 2 guns, the delicate moving parts that let a gun soak up its own firing and swing to aim. When thermite burns down into those parts, the metal flows and fuses and cools into a single useless lump. Then he went along the line and smashed the sights of the guns with the buttstock of his Thompson submachine gun, wrapping it in his field jacket to muffle the sound, because a gun that cannot be aimed cannot do its job even if it can still fire. Lommel later described his own method without any grandeur. He said he used the thermite to try to weld together whatever moving parts he could reach: gears, cranks, hinges, breech blocks, wherever the flowing molten metal would run and seize. He reckoned the whole business of disabling those guns took him something like 10 minutes. Then he and Kuhn slipped back up the lane to the road, told the others what they had found, and gathered every thermite grenade the rest of the Rangers were carrying. They went back down the lane a second time to finish the remaining guns. Quietly, methodically, 2 men unmade the battery that weeks of Allied bombing had never managed to touch. There is a second thread to the destruction, and honesty about the record requires telling it, because more than one group of Rangers reached those guns. At close to the same time, a separate patrol coming at the position from a slightly different direction, led by a staff sergeant named Frank Rapinski, also found the guns and the ammunition. Not knowing that Lommel and Kuhn had already been at work, this second group set about wrecking the guns as well, and destroyed a large stock of powder, setting off an explosion that rocked the whole area. Lommel and Kuhn, back near the road, felt the blast, and at first assumed a stray naval shell had struck an ammunition dump. It is worth being careful and honest here, because the credit has been argued over ever since. The official United States Army history actually gave Company E the finishing of the guns, describing Lommel's party as having gone back for more grenades while another patrol completed the job. Later accounts, including Lommel's own testimony, place him first among the guns and give his hands the decisive work, with Rapinski's patrol destroying the powder supply. The exact division of credit is one of the few things about this action that the record leaves genuinely open, and it would be false to pretend otherwise. What is not in doubt is the outcome. The guns at Pointe du Hoc were found inland, unmanned, ready to fire, and they were disabled by Rangers on foot before they could send a single shell toward the beaches or the fleet. By roughly the middle of the morning, before 9 o'clock, the road behind the point had been cut, and the guns had been put out of action. Word went back that the mission was accomplished. By that measure, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had done something remarkable. They were arguably the first American unit of the entire invasion to reach and complete its D-Day objective. That fact is worth holding on to against the noise of everything that went wrong that morning: the swamped boats, the navigation error, the late landing, the empty pits. In the middle of all that friction, a battered handful of men had climbed an impossible cliff, crossed a cratered wasteland, pushed inland through hedgerows, found the hidden guns by following marks in the dirt, and destroyed them, all before 9 o'clock. The plan had failed in almost every particular except the one that counted. The guns that could have raked 2 invasion beaches would never fire on the men coming ashore. Now step back and look at what actually happened here, because the mechanism is the whole point of the story. The German army was very good at protecting things from bombs and shells. They understood, better than almost anyone in 1944, that Allied air power and naval gunfire were murderous, and that a gun left sitting in the open on a coastal cliff was a gun waiting to be smashed from above. So all along the Atlantic Wall they buried their guns in concrete, they dispersed them, they camouflaged them, and where they could, they moved them and left decoys in their place. At Pointe du Hoc, that doctrine worked exactly as designed. The guns survived. Weeks of heavy bombing fell on that cliff, and the 6 French pieces came through it intact, because they were no longer there to be hit. Judged purely as a way to defeat bombs and naval shells, the German plan was a complete success. But protecting a weapon from bombs is not the same thing as protecting it from the enemy, and this is the gap the Germans fell into. Their whole scheme of concealment answered one question, and answered it brilliantly. How do we keep aircraft and warships from destroying these guns? It simply never answered a different and equally important question. What happens if determined men climb the cliff, cross the point, and come looking for the guns on foot, with orders to destroy them wherever they are found. The concealment that defeated the airplane was worthless against the infantryman standing next to the gun. Camouflage hides a weapon from eyes at a distance. It does nothing at all against a sergeant close enough to drop a thermite grenade into the breach. There is a bitter irony buried in how the Germans had fortified the place, and it deepens the point. The evidence suggests they regarded Pointe du Hoc as very nearly impregnable from the sea, which is a reasonable thing to think about a cliff 100 feet high. So they oriented their heaviest close defences, their mines and their wire, to face inland, toward an attack coming overland from the interior. The seaward approach, the cliff itself, they largely trusted to gravity and rock. When the Rangers did the one thing the defenders had half discounted, coming straight up the sea cliff and then pushing inland toward the very fields where the guns were hidden, the defense was oriented the wrong way to stop them. And why were the crews not at their guns in the 1 hour that mattered? The official history offers the most likely explanation, and it flows from the same cause as everything else. The bombardment had been so heavy and so sustained that it drove the artillerymen away from the exposed position and scattered them into shelter, and it disorganized them so thoroughly that they never got back to the guns in time. There is a deeper point tucked inside that. A coastal gun cannot fire accurately at distant ships without its observers and its fire control working smoothly, and the whole apparatus on the point had been battered into confusion. The Germans had built a machine for killing ships that depended on many parts working in concert: the observers in their bunker, the telephone lines, the crews, the guns. The bombardment did not need to destroy the guns to defeat that machine. It only needed to break the coordination, scatter the men, and buy a few hours. And into that window of broken coordination walked the Rangers. This is the part of the story that rewards slow thinking, because it shows that the German failure was not really a failure of courage or of equipment. The men of that coastal battery were not cowards, and their guns were not junk. What broke down was the seam between the pieces of their system. A coastal battery in 1944 was a chain of dependencies. Observers had to see the target. Telephone lines or radios had to carry the corrections. Crews had to be at their pieces, rested and ready. Ammunition had to be at hand and fuzzed. Break any one link and the whole chain goes slack. The bombardment of Pointe du Hoc, sustained over weeks and then hammered home in the final hours, did not need to shatter every gun to defeat the battery. It only had to shake the men loose from their careful routine, cut the wires, blind the observers, and scatter the crews away from their guns at the one moment those guns were needed. By the time the invasion actually arrived, the guns sat ready in their inland orchard. But the human system that turned them from lengths of steel into a working weapon had come apart. The Rangers did not defeat the battery in a duel. They walked into the gap the bombardment had already opened, and they closed it for good, with thermite and rifle butts. So the comparison stands clean. The German idea was that a weapon you cannot see is a weapon you cannot destroy. Hide it well enough and it survives. The Allied idea did not depend on seeing the guns at all. It depended on putting a body of aggressive, independent-minded infantry physically onto the objective with a clear and stubborn order. Destroy the guns wherever they are. Cut the road behind them. The Rangers did not need a fresh photograph of the guns. They needed boots, grenades, and the initiative to follow strange tracks down a sunken lane without being told to. The German plan was optimized against the threat of 1944's air and sea power. It did not account for the oldest threat in all of warfare: a determined man with a weapon walking up to your position and refusing to leave until the job is done. Notice, too, how the Allied approach layered redundancy on top of redundancy, and how that defeated the single clever German trick at every level. The Germans moved the guns once. It was one decisive, well-executed act of concealment. Against that single move, the Allies had stacked layer upon layer, intelligence from aerial photographs and from the resistance that had flagged the battery as a priority target for months. A decision at the top to send the mission even when some suspected the guns had already gone. Orders that pushed the Rangers inland into the exact belt of ground where the guns turned out to be hidden. 2 separate patrols that independently stumbled onto the battery and set about wrecking it. Even the destruction itself was doubled: thermite in the mechanisms, smashed sights, and an exploded powder store. The German scheme had one point of failure that it had brilliantly protected: the guns being seen from the air and smashed by bombs. It had no answer at all for an enemy who did not need to see them first. The Rangers had accomplished the offensive part of their mission by mid-morning. What followed was arguably even harder, and it is a part of the story the myth of the empty guns tends to erase completely. Having destroyed the battery, the small force on the point was now isolated, cut off, and lightly armed, expected to hold a scrap of enemy coastline until the main advance from Omaha Beach could fight its way up to relieve them. That relief was slow in coming. The message that came back to them in those first hours was blunt. No reinforcements were available. Every Ranger, the message said, had already been committed at Omaha, so they dug in and held. They pulled back from their most exposed positions to a tighter perimeter and held along the coastal road and around the shattered point through the rest of the 6th of June and into the night. The only help that reached them that first day was a mere handful of men, a few American paratroopers who had been misdropped far from their own units and drifted to the point, and a small party of about 24 Rangers from the follow-up battalion who had landed at Omaha and fought their way overland, arriving that evening under a young lieutenant and even bringing a clutch of German prisoners with them. That was all. A few dozen extra men against a German force that was steadily gathering itself for a counterstroke. The counterattacks came in the dark, delivered by German infantry of the 914th Grenadier Regiment. There were 3 of them through the night, probing at first and then heavier, and the last and strongest came in the small hours of the 7th of June, around 3 in the morning. It fell on the Rangers holding the line south of the coastal highway and broke through in places. One platoon holding an exposed stretch was overrun and lost the better part of 20 men killed or captured in that single attack. The surviving officer on that part of the line pulled the remnants back toward the point, and by the time the sun came up, the perimeter had shrunk to a hard little knot of men clinging to the ground nearest the cliff, low on ammunition, low on everything. They held through the 7th of June as well. The men in that perimeter were down to scavenge German weapons and captured ammunition in places, because their own was running out. They were exhausted, many of them wounded, and still they held the ground they had climbed for. There is a hard and human truth in the record of those 2 days that ought to be spoken rather than smoothed over. Fighting for survival, cut off and outnumbered, some Rangers found themselves unable to guard or feed the prisoners they took, and prisoners were killed. The official history nods at this only obliquely, noting that there could be no question of bringing prisoners back. It is not a detail that fits comfortably into a heroic narrative, but leaving it out would be a kind of lie, and the men who lived through those nights deserve the truth of them, not a polished version. Relief finally reached the point on the morning of the 8th of June, 2 full days after the Rangers had come up the cliff, when Rangers and infantry pushing up from Omaha with tanks in support at last broke through. When the relief force counted the men who could still stand and fight, the arithmetic was brutal. Of the roughly 225 Rangers who had landed at the base of the cliff on D-Day, only about 90 were still able to bear arms. The battalion's losses across the whole action ran to dozens killed, well over 100 wounded, and dozens more missing. Rudder himself had been wounded twice and had kept command throughout, once nearly being killed when a captured German position he had taken shelter in was struck and collapsed, killing men around him and leaving him carrying fragments in his body. He led the whole 2-day ordeal in constant pain and never let go of the command. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, as did more than a dozen of his Rangers, and the 2nd Ranger Battalion was later honored with a Presidential Unit citation for what it had done on that headland. It is worth pausing on the myth itself, because it took hold so firmly, and because dismantling it is the final proof of what the Rangers achieved. The idea that the assault was a pointless waste, that brave men climbed a deadly cliff only to find the guns had never been there, owes much of its life to a famous book about the invasion and the celebrated film made from it, which ended the Pointe du Hoc scene on a note of bitter futility. A Ranger staring at empty emplacements as if the whole thing had been for nothing. That image lodged in the public mind and has stayed there for decades, but it does not survive contact with what actually happened on the ground that morning. The guns were not phantoms. They were real. They were loaded. They were aimed at Utah Beach, and they were minutes of organization away from firing into the invasion. They were found and destroyed by Rangers on foot before they could fire a shot. Lieutenant Eichner, Rudder's communications officer, put the reality bluntly in his later recollection. Had the Rangers not been there, he said, those guns would have been put into operation, and they would have brought death and destruction down on the men on the beaches and the ships at sea. There is a genuine historical argument that sits alongside this one, and it deserves an honest mention rather than a tidy dismissal. In more recent years, researchers have drawn fresh attention to another German battery a few miles away, near a place called Maisie, which was well hidden, which went on firing at the American beaches for days, and which was not cleared until later in the invasion. Some have argued that this other battery was the more dangerous threat, and that its story was long overlooked. That argument has real value in widening the picture, and the Rangers did in fact go on to take the Maisie position in the days after the 6th. But it does not overturn the core of what happened at Pointe du Hoc. The guns on that cliff were a top priority target, correctly identified, and they were operational weapons capable of ranging 2 invasion beaches. Neutralizing them before they could fire was not a mistake. It was the mission, and the mission was accomplished. The men who carried it out lived long and varied lives, and it is worth knowing what became of them, because they were not characters in a film, but real people who went home. James Earl Rudder came out of the war a decorated commander and went back to Texas, where he entered public life and eventually became the president of Texas A&M University, guiding that institution through years of enormous change before his death in 1970. Leonard Lomell, the sergeant in the lane, took a battlefield commission later in the campaign, fought on through some of the hardest battles that followed, and came home to become a lawyer in New Jersey. For the rest of his life he spoke about that morning with a plainness that never inflated his own part in it, and one respected historian went so far as to call him one of the individuals most responsible for the success of D-Day, second only to the Supreme Commander himself. Jack Kuhn, the man who covered him among the guns, served again in a later war and went on to a long career in law enforcement, rising to lead a city police department. These were ordinary American men who did one extraordinary thing in a Normandy field, and then returned to ordinary lives, which is perhaps the most human part of the whole account. The cliff itself still bears the marks of that morning. Pointe du Hoc is preserved now as a memorial, its ground left cratered and torn, much as the bombardment left it, the broken concrete of the observation bunker and the gun positions still standing above the sea. Visitors walk among the craters and look down the sheer face the Rangers came up, and the single most common reaction, by every account, is disbelief that men climbed it at all, let alone into fire. Rudder himself, returning years later with his young son and looking up at the height he had scaled, is said to have wondered aloud how any of them had ever done it, and to have called it a thing that would seem impossible to attempt in cold blood. The ground keeps the memory in a way words struggle to. 4 decades after the battle, an American president stood on that same cliff, on the 40th anniversary of the landing, and spoke to a row of aging men sitting in front of him, the survivors themselves. He described how 225 Rangers had come off the landing craft at the foot of those cliffs on the morning of the 6th of June, and how after 2 days of fighting, only about 90 could still bear arms. He called the men in front of him the ones who took the cliffs, the champions who helped free a continent, the heroes who helped end a war. It fixed Pointe du Hoc in the public memory at last, not as a place of futile sacrifice, but as a place where ordinary men did something very close to impossible and made it count for something. And that is the real lesson of the guns that were not there. The Germans did something genuinely intelligent when they moved that battery inland, and it is important to say that plainly, because the easy version of this story sneers at them for guarding empty holes, and the easy version is wrong. Their concealment worked. The bombs never touched the guns. What defeated them in the end was not a better bomb or a sharper photograph, or some clever piece of Allied trickery. What defeated them was a difference in thinking about what it even means to protect a weapon. The German plan treated the danger as something that came from the sky and the sea, something that had to see its target before it could kill it, and so they made the target impossible to see. The Allied plan treated the guns as an objective to be reached and destroyed by men on the ground, and it sent those men forward with enough independence and enough sheer stubbornness that a set of empty gun pits did not stop them for a moment. One side hid the weapon and trusted that it would survive. The other side reached the weapon and made sure it died. Both ideas were coherent, and both had hard logic behind them. Only one of them fit the actual ground of that morning, the cliffs and the hedgerows and the sunken lanes, and the particular kind of soldier who had been trained above all else to keep moving when the plan fell apart. The guns at Pointe du Hoc were moved to save them, and moving them is precisely what placed them in the path of the men who unmade them. They were hidden almost perfectly, and found anyway, by two sergeants walking down a farm lane behind enemy lines, wondering where a set of tracks in the dirt would lead. If this account gave you something to think about, something beyond the old story of the empty guns, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps this kind of careful history reach the people who care about getting it right.